What if the EU tried to regulate the color of the sun? This is quite an absurd scenario, but it's also the central theme of the book written by our today's guest. And we asked him, can such fictional stories really help to make the EU more understandable? And can they explain the power struggles going on in the corridors of Brussels? Listen in to find out what he said.
Is the EU a democracy? I don't think it is. It was not designed to be one. We have the European Parliament, and without offense to anyone working there, a parliament that has no taxation powers, who has no legislative initiative, which have basically the two core powers of any parliament in any democracy. But is it a real parliament? The EU is extremely transparent. We cannot blame the EU for hiding things. You can find all the documents you want, but it is so transparent that you get lost.
How do you prevent that the lobbyists which are best funded and which have the most money behind them become the most powerful?
And I don't even think at some point that money may be the critical factor, because I've seen very successful campaigns from NGOs which were probably not very rich. So it's what you do with your money, and creativity sometimes can bring you much further than money.
Our guest, Vincent Guerre, is a Brussels insider who has worked for the European Parliament, the European Commission and industry associations. In his satirical book, The Son-in-Law, he uses humour to explain how the EU functions, which actors are the most powerful and how decisions are made. This fictional story, in which the EU tries to regulate the colour of the sun, shows how laws are made and how anyone with the right skills can influence them. Vincent, if you could explain to a 15-year-old how the EU really works, what would you say?
Well, I think I could say things that are obvious, that the EU is peace, is free circulation and so on, but I think they know about that. And they pretty well know the Europe, they watch Champions League matches, so they know about countries, they know all these things. But I think what they don't really get, and not only young people, is the sense of community that is behind the EU. And what is the common interest behind? And I quite like to use analogies. And my favorite is to compare the EU with a residential building. So look, you all live in your flat. You have a flat owner. You do whatever you like in your flat. You have dinner when you want. You furnish the flat as you like. Nobody will ask anything. But you also have an interest in having a building in a good state, when maintained, because then your flat would be in a bad situation. In a way, it's like the EU. You appoint a building manager, which is somehow the European Commission. You task them with recommending what would be the good way for managing the building. But at some point, those who decide, they are the flat owners. They are the ones who have to decide on a common budget. They are the ones to decide whether or not they will renovate the lift, on whether or not they want a common heating system. So this is basically the council. And you see that every time you need to decide on common expenditure, that, I want the works, but I don't want to pay for them. And you have a fight between the big ones, the small ones, those in the attic who are suffering from the leaks, and those in the basements. So it's this kind of mess where people have a common interests, but also a common interest of being together, because if the opposite building gets very nasty and just makes your life impossible, or throwing garbage to you or whatever, you are quite happy to have a good building manager to also make things done. So if you're alone, it's a bit more difficult. So that's how I like to explain it.
Well, what works better, the EU or a residential building?
Well, sometimes the quality of the building manager makes a lot of difference, and because it's you have to find what is really the common interests. And what I find also quite difficult now in the EU is there is quite a lot of disalignment between some of the co-owners, the member states. And you may have the best building manager if at the end they just say this is what is best for the building. Take the Draghi report, for example. A good diagnosis of what we should do, and everybody recognizes that. But at the end, you have to pay, you have to decide, and it creates tension. And this is where, a well-managed building can make a difference, and the same with a well-managed EU.
And of course, coordination and management is very important. But is there one huge misconception that you think people have about the EU?
Well, main misconception is that the EU is boring. Definitely not. I think I laugh every day in my job, and I spent many years also working in EU institutions. I think every day was fun. But I think it's largely perceived as kind of insiders' jokes by the external world, like bubble jokes. So we have to find a way to pop that bubble, and it's what I've tried to do with my book to make it accessible. And you certainly know this French TV series Parliament. They do it very well. Showing, they exaggerate a bit, but still they give like a vision of this world that is accessible and that is fun. And it is fun. It's full of fun people. Even sometimes some situations are really absurd, but it's really what I would like to convey.
And do you think like this effort of using satire to explain in a simplistic way how EU laws are done has been successful?
What I've tried to do is, I wrote that book, The Son-in-Law, which tells the story of how a crazy law on the color of the sun would be negotiated. And I went step by step. So it's quite a big book, 600 pages, but it's 90 short scenes, which each of them takes one step of the process. So it starts with groundwork at the Commission, or people in charge of making an impact assessment, of consulting stakeholders. You have all kinds of lobbyists also being interested in what good color should be implemented. But I really wanted to be very accurate on the description. So the topic is absolutely absurd, like there's sometimes some discussions in the book on really they play with color cards but the process, is well explained. It was really my purpose here, and using satire helps a lot because you take some distance with the topic. Where you say, okay, this is how it works, and I get it much easier. And I wrote that book mainly also for the people I represent as a lobbyist. So I'm an industry lobbyist for the shipbuilding sector, and I'm representing people who are engineers, industry people. They often tell me, "Wow, we really don't understand the EU. It's not our world." I say, "Okay, yeah, I get it, and you are engineers, so let's look at the mechanics. You like mechanics, I will show you the mechanics of the machinery." And it started like that, to really explain to them this process, and why also as a lobbyist, sometimes I'm asking input from them at what moment, for what purpose, when I'm doing a position paper, while I'm meeting that type of people in the policy making system. And I also like to I make analogies between political science and the hard sciences. My engineers, they always tell me, political science or bullshit science. But in a way, compare it, with hard science. So you have political physics. It's basically the rules of the game, so how the procedures, the institutions, how they work, how the system is framed. Then you have political biology, so the organisms, the MEPs, the commissioners, the lobbyists, how they all want to survive and to eat each other at some point. So it's how they operate within the system.
Is there a virus also?
Yeah, lots of virus.
Who's the virus?
Well, we have some external virus, and also some internal disease sometimes, but we come back to that. And then you also have chemistry. So it's the ideas, ideologies, interests, they create reactions. It may explode sometimes, or you never quite know how it will react. It could be for the best or for the worst. And you also have something that the hard science cannot explain. It's alchemy. In politics, you may trigger some results that are highly unpredictable, and you see everything that happens with Donald Trump, for example. Who could have predicted that some years ago? So that's the way I like to explain it, and what the book tried to convey.
Yeah, and I find myself like super unique now, mixing this creative approach in explaining the EU. Do you feel, are you many out there, or you're a bit an outlier?
Well, I really wanted with that book to present myself as an insider, a guy who knows the system, but who has some distance with it, because I'm a practitioner of the system. My bread and butter is to live from the system and to represent interest. But I'm also a European citizen. I also believe that that project is the right thing to do, but it may be diluted into certain forms of complexity. So I only wanted to show. I understand the system. There are some ways to correct certain dysfunctionalities, but first you need to understand it.
Yeah. And talking about understanding the EU, we have the Commission, the Parliament, that you work in both of them, and now you work in industry. In Brussels, simply, who has more power?
Well, I really sometimes wonder if power is the right word. Is there a real power in the EU in the sense we understand it is in a national system? Because it's quite diluted. It's more kind of a network of different types of influence. But I would say, if you mean like those who have the power of starting the engine, it's definitely the European Council, the member states at the highest level. If they don't want to do anything, nothing happens. If they want to do something, the machine follows. And then there is the power of now those who drive the car once the engine is started. And there it's largely the Commission, because they hold the pen, they have the monopoly of legislative initiative, they have the expertise. Of course, then the co-legislators decide, but the Commission is really the driving force. But all this works when everything is combined. You need the engine to get started, and then the machinery to implement it. If you have only one of them, it will not go far. You may have like a very strong council position. If you don't have a machinery behind, it's nothing. And if you don't have any push from the high level, the machinery is nothing. And then you have a network of influence from all kinds of stakeholders, lobbyists, and so on, and which interact with all these parts and make it at the end a very lively ecosystem.
And as a lobbyist, because that's what you are now doing mainly, what institution are you targeting?
Well, if you're a good lobbyist, you should target all of them. But first, perhaps let's be clear on what is a lobbyist and what it is not. Do you know that the origin of the word it comes from the UK Parliament some centuries ago? It was basically the whole way of the Parliament, and there was a practice that every week stakeholders could come in that hallway to meet very informally the members of Parliament, so in the lobby.
Yeah.
So as a lobbyist, you spend quite a lot of time in the lobby, but your aim is to be invited at the table, so not to wait endlessly. So basically, a lobbyist is any organization or person who tries to influence policymakers for an interest or a cause. It's not only corporate interests, because we often hear, it's big companies, and yes, they are lobbyists. Some sectoral associations are also lobbyists. I work for one of them representing an entire sector. But NGOs are also lobbyists. They may defend specific causes, being human rights, consumer rights, whatever, any cause. But they cannot claim to represent citizens. They represent a cause defended by some citizens. So it's very important to get that right. And then you need to be very transparent. There is a transparency register. You need to say who you are, what you represent, who is funding you, who are the people who are representing you. And so it has to start with that. Then the way you operate as a good lobbyist, you have to do basically three things. First thing, if you want to be successful, because you can also shout in the lobby if you want, but nobody will open the door. First, I think you have to show that what you represent is connected and aligns to, let's say, political objectives. Whether you are representing an industry or a cause, you have to say, look, it's true that it's a very specific point, but it's in line also with the general policy objectives. It contributes to them. And so you need to create a story. I'm representing the shipbuilding sector. Our story is that basically we are the hardware of the entire maritime economy. That we are building ships for everything, for transport, for offshore wind, for the navy. And then you need that. Then you need to come with very concrete demands. I see a lot of lobbyists who still come in their position papers with like, we want to be competitive or we want to be resilient. I mean, what does it mean? What do you want? People at the commission, holding the pen. Okay, yeah. What do you want me to write in policy? So you need to come with very concrete proposals and things that are actionable, realistic. So if you say I want to change the treaties, yeah, okay, you may have some trouble, but you need to also to understand the political agenda, where we are now, what is realistic, what you want in that piece of legislation, in that fund, with very concrete things. So it's what we've done in my organization. And then you need to prove that. You need to make your case with data, evidence, not just opinions. You should not just say I'm an important sector, I'm strategic. Yeah, well, why? What is your market data? What are your lead markets? And proving that you have a point. So if you have that, you already have a strong situation to then engage with commission at different levels, parliament, council, everyone.
And I think, that lobbying, for example, in Italy is seen as something negative, something bad, something shady, behind the curtains. Do you feel this also yourself in your daily activities, that people are perceiving you like this, or no?
No, I'm also a member of the board of the Society of European Affairs Professionals, so which is in a way the lobby of lobbyists, if you want. So it's the association that represents all professionals of public affairs in EU affairs. I would say, look, there is nothing shady because we are in the transparency register. We also have our own code of conduct. And in that job, if you don't play by the rule, if you're not transparent, you will not go far. Policymakers are not idiots. I'm always very amazed to read sometimes in the press that there are some lobbyists talking to people at the parliament's bar. Yeah, but you think the MEP is idiot? They also know whom they can trust. You also have to bring a bit of credibility into policymakers. But then it's true, lobbyists who would not play by those rules of transparency and accuracy in what they say would not go far. Reputation is important. Lobbying happens all the time. And you mentioned Italy. I'm sure lobbying happens perhaps without being mentioned. But, there are all kinds of influence. A CEO calling a minister is lobbying.
I think the real question, of course, is how do you prevent that the lobbyists which are best funded and which have the most money behind them become the most powerful?
That's a very good question. I think there are two things. The first thing is the ethics of the policymakers themselves. That when you are an elected member of parliament or a commission official, you should have this discipline to also talk with everyone who is relevant in your field. At the commission, there are procedures for that. It's very well organized. The way you collect evidence is very well structured. And then on the lobbying side, I think it's being very clear that we are a profession that is necessary for democracy, but it has to be done in the right way. And there is no hierarchy between corporate interest and civil society interest. And I don't even think at some point that money may be the critical factor, because I've seen very successful campaigns from NGOs, which were probably not very rich, although some have a lot of resources. But it's how you articulate a good campaign, good arguments. Money, you can have more staff, you can pay more studies, but you will definitely not use that money to bribe policymakers. This is fraud. So it's what you do with your money, and creativity sometimes can bring you much further than money.
Interesting. And of course, it's a very complex ecosystem overall. But in a nutshell, if you had to say what works in the EU and what doesn't, what would you say?
What already works, it's still there. So it's already a big achievement. We have a single market that creates benefits. We are recognized as a reliable trade partner worldwide. We have managed to overcome certain big crises. We have a financial crisis 15 years ago. We had COVID. The system always managed to create inventive solutions. It's there. But what doesn't work, I think, is the treaties are definitely not fit for purpose anymore. And I have the feeling we are somehow in between two systems. Between the initial system that was creating a single market, so basically working on things that are not so sensitive, not so touchy for member states, and basically sharing benefits together. And the EU is pretty good at sharing benefits. And the other system is going the extra mile on something that would look more like a federation. And we are stuck in between. And I think this is well known since the Maastricht Treaty. It was already at the time very clearly explained. And it's something I really struggled to explain to the industry people I represent. We have a single market, we have a single monetary policy, and still we have fragmented economic policies, fiscal policies. We have a very tiny European budget that has no macroeconomic role at all. So we are depriving ourselves basically of economic policy, of using all the tools of economic policy consistently. Like all the other powers in the world are doing, the US, China, and so on. They are combining all that. I know we are talking more and more about industrial policy, and we have this clean industrial deal and this big ambition. But if you want to do industrial policy, which is, by the way, only a supportive competence of the EU, not a hard competence, you need to put all that together: taxation, in public investment, single market, monetary policy, and we can't do that. So I think we have to make some choice at some point. Do we want just to go back to what it was initially, a single market, a trade policy, or do we want to go further and to really do policy? It doesn't need to go on very sensitive things like defense or others, but at least on the economic policy side. The system, just as it is, does not allow us to resolve. And I think there have been very good attempts from Draghi, for example, to try to see what we could do within the current system, but we are stuck. So for me, it's clear we have to make a choice: going back or going further.
Yeah. And I think like these attempts are like done more at a technical level, no? But to change this, to change the treaty, you really need politics that is based on public consensus. So do you think where the EU citizens stand on average, like more for a more unified Europe or more for coming back to member states power?
Well, you give me a very big task of talking for people, and I will not go that way, but I would reply with a question. Do you think that citizens really have the opportunity to discuss and reflect on that? Because I think what they perceive from the EU through the media does not allow a proper reflection or to make a proper judgment. And I do not want to blame the media here. I rather want to blame the political parties. Because in any democracy, it's basically their job to bring topics to the attention of people and to organize deliberations and public debate. And in political parties nationally do not bring the European topics as the level it should be. It remains an insider topic. So for me, this is where the failure is. Political parties are not doing their job.
And here we come to the core of the problem, that the system is designed in a way that also politicians don't have an incentive to bring these topics on the political agenda, right? Because in the end, they're elected only by their national constituency. They don't really have to care what people in other countries think about them.
That's indeed the problem. And look, we could ask the question, is the EU a democracy? I don't think it is. It was not designed to be one. It was designed, if you read the memoir of Jean Monnet, the engineer behind that, it's basically creating a community, supranational institutions to implement certain policies that are of common interest while being protected from the daily friction between member states. But the power remains with member states, which are self-aware that they will themselves fight each other. So we say, look, some things are very important. We want the EU to act, and we protect the EU from our attempts to divert the problem. And it was a union of states. Then we have the European Parliament intervening in the process. But is it a real parliament? And without offense to anyone working there, a parliament that has no taxation powers, who has no legislative initiative, which have basically the two core powers of any parliament in any democracy, then we have a problem. And then the way it is elected it's more a patchwork of national elections. No, the election happens nationally, and then people gather in political groups, but they are not political parties. They are not framing any common political agenda, any common coalition. So there is a design problem, but there is also a problem of the people operating in that design, who may make some change if they wish, without changing the treaty. There are some possibilities.
Do you feel it's absolutely necessary that we have a true European democracy in order to move to a more federal system? Or can it also go the other way around, that we first have a more federal system and maybe then we move to a more European democracy?
I think if you go to a federal system, that would require, let's say, policy choices that would interfere more into what we know as national sovereignty. You definitely need a strong democratic backing. You cannot do these things behind people's back. So there are certain things where we can advance in the current setup. It's more collaboration. It doesn't harm the core of the national sovereignty, but you don't go very far with that. But again, the question is it what we want? Is it what people want? I do not know, because the question is not asked to them. And to be honest with you, I have a very bitter memory from the European Constitution 20 years ago. There was a referendum in my country, in France. And it's when I really started to be aware of the EU, I campaigned for the yes. But what was presented to people was a constitution. It was no constitution. It was some tweaks to the treaties, and not very substantial ones, because the big substantial change was the Maastricht Treaty, a decade before. So then you present and you label as a constitution something that is a technical tweak, and you invest a lot of symbolism in something that doesn't match that expectation. And then you wonder why people are frustrated. So, and I think we have not gone over that. When we talk about constitution, it should be a real constitution. And you should not present to people's vote something that is more a technical arrangement. And I come back to the critical thing, is that we need, at some point, political leaders to really put the question on the table in realistic terms.
And I also think that we need political leaders that are able to convey the message of added value of the European Union in the daily life of citizens. Because just one quick example, Brexit, like the average citizens lost around £2,300 per year just due to the Brexit. So why we don't exploit these communication opportunities?
True, it's one part. But I think a problem also with the system as it is, that it tries to justify itself as a system. To say the EU is good for that reason. But in fact, it's a political system. So what should be defended is what policy choices are made. So by the people who made them, so a majority and a coalition deciding on certain things and fighting another part of the spectrum. But I don't see that so much. It's more the system defending itself. Yeah. And this should happen at the European Parliament mainly. And having a very clear coalition, stable over time, with people committed to that. But it's so fluctuating, and the basic also is that MEPs rather belong to their national party.
Yeah, but also committed to say it well, not just ideologically being united is good, but also in concrete terms, people are better off. Also the single market, the impact of the single market on the average income of citizens has been very positive, but there is not awareness out there. European parties, they should really make an effort there.
But we always go back to this very basic issue when there are elections. Do we want more or less Europe, or Europe did bad? A system is neutral. Nobody is asking whether France or Italy is good or bad. It's the people governing France or Italy who are judged and accountable.
I fully agree. And I also think that there is this appetite among you citizens. It's just that is not exploited. Yeah.
Probably. But again, it's how, it's quite difficult also for a citizen to find this information, because it's true the EU is extremely transparent. We cannot blame the EU for hiding things. You can find all the documents you want, but it is so transparent that you get lost. and you don't know where to find. And it's difficult. The European Commission is doing excellent job in trying to put everything on web pages, but at the end you need interpreters. Who are the interpreters? The media and political parties.
Because in the end, and then I stop with this, is a huge discriminant, like also in Italy among political parties. Like some, they want a more federal Europe. Some others, they want to come back to more power to a member state. So if I'm an European party, I will just convey in concrete terms for these citizens, this is the added value. But in your opinion, there is not awareness of this? They just, is in the back of their minds? Or...
These are very easy battles for national politicians, because they also themselves do not conceptualize. If you want to go the extra mile in integration, it's for a specific purpose, whether you want to have a real economic policy, for example. But we hear sometimes from the same politicians the things that are totally contradictory. You may hear one saying, the EU is over-regulating the fishing nets, for example. I was working in fisheries before. And the same person would say, but at the same time, EU is doing nothing for dumping from Eastern countries. But there is no powers for the EU in that matter. And, on the one hand, you blame over-regulation. On the other hand, you pretend there is under-regulation. So, people are also are using things that they think is helping them in politics, but at the end it's not.
You also have our Prime Minister in Italy that wanted to exit Euro, and now she's clearly in favor of the single market. So
I think people evolve also when they realize the complexity of it, and there are no silver bullets in politics nowadays, and perhaps the EU was created with that in mind, that everything will go well naturally, that we will share benefits, we'll create a single market, and it has delivered. But now we have to learn on how to share the shit, because it's all about that now, and it's where the consensus is not happening. Sharing benefits is easy. Sharing difficulties between member states, between businesses, you need first to formulate the terms for such a compromise. And I come back to the analogy with a residential building. When you need to decide whether you undertake big renovations, there are lots of things to discuss. Where to start first, how to fund, with what company to do the works. If it's not formulated well, you will just loop again in pointless discussions, and it's where I think the discussion is missing now. And you see every European Council, they always make the same diagnosis. They all agree, we have a problem. Draghi is right, but at the end, action is not coming because it's too painful for national systems which are so dependent on the illusion of their national sovereignty.
Let's talk for a moment about a situation where clearly change is happening, which is the elections in Hungary, which happened 2 weeks ago, where people clearly show that they do care about Europe. In the victory speech of Magyar, the crowds were chanting Europe, Europe. So that was evidently an element which contributed maybe to a choice against Orbán. How do you see now the possible new government influencing also European politics?
It's difficult to say and to also to interpret also what you also hear from crowds, right? So I would not like to draw any conclusion from that, but I think also let's look at Orbán was really a troublemaker, but he was not blocking structurally the system. He was occasionally disrupting, but the problem is not in having a rogue state like that or a rogue person creating problems. The problem is in the European Council not being decisive, with or without Orbán. Orbán is not helping, true, but then the heart of the problem is not there. It's also on having disalignment between France and Germany to a large extent, and on not being capable on calling a spade a spade. We have different views on energy policy, on investment policy, on budget, on defense, on everything. Yeah, we know that, but are we capable of finding a common ground for resolving that? Are we attempting to resolving that at all? Or do we just say, okay, we disagree, we agree that we disagree? And I think the problem is rather there. And it's sometimes very convenient to use Orbán to just say, well, there's that guy making problem, we cannot advance. Brexit was also the same. It has all the effort put into negotiating Brexit has also diverted a lot of energy from the machine.
But at the same time, of course, it's true that Orban has blocked some decisions, notably with Ukraine, Russia, and so on. But you don't see that as the core of the problem, if I understand you well.
I don't know. I think it's an occasional problem, like a grain in the mechanics, which can be very damaging and can really hurt your engine. But the core is that the engine is not starting.
And how do you solve that problem?
I think we have to go back to where the core power is. The EU is a union of states. So it's with their leaders at the European Council. Every time I read the European Council conclusions, I'm every day more desperate to see, good problem definition, well done, but...
So you're one of the few people who actually read the Council conclusions.
But it's also... I observe now a kind of a tendency to put all the blame on the president of the commission, for everything that goes wrong, and she would have overstepped everything. She signed a deal with Trump. But she was instructed by member states on that, or at least by some of them saying, go for the deal. And who is accountable at the end? That's also the big problem. Accountability is not traceable by citizens. Of course, you will naturally turn to the president of the commission because it's the most visible figure. But does she hold so much power? I don't think so. And it's the collective accountability of the European Council that is lacking.
I think it's also normal for people to focus on one person because the council is 27 people. How are you going to blame
And it's
someone?
exactly the game they are playing because they say, we can hide. Yeah. And I don't mean that they have a deliberate plan of doing that. It's just also, many countries are also stuck with difficult coalitions, with elections coming. So the momentum they have nationally is never optimum. But it's never optimum for anyone. So at the end, you just don't push any topic because it's not the right moment. It's never the right moment.
And in the deal with Trump, in the end, not the pressure from member states was coming from some specific member state, and some of them like quite the biggest one. So do you think there is an asymmetry in influencing the president of the commission? It's not really like each member state has the
It's
same
also
way.
a problem of how the system has evolved. There is indeed increased centralization at the commission, and some member states they pick and choose, and they push their own agenda directly with the commission. The system was never designed like that. The commission was supposed to be shielded from these attempts, and it's also probably the signal that something doesn't go smooth in the...
Doesn't it also show that maybe the European dimension becomes a bit more important than the member state dimension if people go directly to the commission? It's also recognition of the increased power, no?
Perhaps, but it's also that we lose sight of what makes a community. The job of the commission is to define the European common interest, the general interest. And it's not a mix of national interests. It's not the right middle of them. It's something that goes beyond that. But indeed, you see more and more attempts to just do traditional diplomacy, to find compromises that are a mix or the right middle between national positions. And it's not how the system should work. When it has really worked at its full speed was in the second half of the 80s, when there was the plan to complete the single market. So it started with very strong political demand from member states, France and Germany first, at the highest level, and then the machinery implementing that. So the Delors Commission at the time, coming with 300 directives, and a modification of treaties to also go to qualified majority vote in more domains. And it worked because everything was very well aligned. And of course, in the daily discussion at the council, when the commission was proposing a directive on whatever liberalization, there was friction, but not friction that was undermining the entire direction of the process. You debate, you find a compromise, the commission is holding the pen, the council votes, but the path is clear.
Yeah, and I think at the time was also a different world. Like in the 80s, there was a lot way more trust in free trade and the benefits of free trade as well. So also now I also think that for unifying Europe, like the external environment is way less positive than it was at the time.
I would nuance that a bit, because in the second part of the completion of the single market, it was the end of it was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So very uncertain times. But at the time, the machine and the political willingness was there to really consolidate something. You know, the Maastricht Treaty, which is the result of that, is a very clear political deal, starting from France and Germany. Saying we need to consolidate Europe and anchor Germany in Europe through the creation of a single currency. So now it's true, we have disruptions everywhere, but I don't think it has to change the entire narrative. Say, look, we have to consolidate what we have, and what I said before, we have to learn how to share the pain, not only the benefits.
Yeah, and to consolidate the EU politically, you also need like to stop with the veto power. We're talking about Hungary. Indeed, Hungary, also in my opinion, is not the problem. The problem is that one single member state can block the entire decision making. But for the audience, to change from veto to qualified majority, we will need a unanimous decision. So it's a bit tricky. It's a bit tricky.
No, but I think it's not something that will resolve itself through technical fix. Never. It can only... Well, I don't know what could change. A big crisis, but honestly, I do not wish there would... We are rather facing a crisis that is very hard, but we are not realizing how hard it is. You know, it's what Draghi called the slow agony in his, when he made a speech on his report. He said, yeah, we have to do something. He was making a speech, I think, to a parliament, but mainly talking to member states. Say, look, you are saying no to everything, to a common budget, to a common debt, to a capital market, and you ask me what I should do. Say, I don't know, but do something. And because indeed, this slow agony is probably the best description of what we are facing now. And we are delaying decisions. We are having quick fixes. And the Commission is good at that. The Commission is good at engineering policies. But if you do not have the right political backing, it's only quick fix. Especially now on everything about industrial policy. You know, we are facing extremely fierce competition from China, unfair competition in many cases, and we are not responding to the scale of that threat because we do not have the tools. It's what I mentioned before. We don't have taxation policy. We don't have a budget. How come can you have a real reindustrialization plan? You can't. You are competing with the Chinese state. Any industry alone here does not have that. And hence, we also are not capable of formulating kind of a trade-off across member states and across industries. Because, of course, if you favor one industry, it will have perhaps bad consequences on another one. How do you rebalance that? How do you mitigate that? It's the core job of policy to have this conceptualization, to say if I support the steel industry, I may harm the shipbuilding industry, but I will give the shipbuilding industry another opportunity and mitigation measures. These things. I may harm my exporters to preserve my domestic market. How do I also make sure I have a comprehensive approach on all that? And I'm missing that.
And how do we solve this? Because in the end, okay, we're facing this slow agony, but we don't have the tools to address it. Unless we have a structural reform. Will we get a structural reform?
Well, I'm not the lobbyist tonight. It's not what I would say to my members because I have to operate in the system as it is. But as a citizen, when you face a toolbox that is not responding to your problem, what do you blame? Do you blame the toolbox, the user? Do you buy a new toolbox? Say, I need to change my engine. I will not do it with just one Newton tool. So I say, I need another toolbox. And what is the toolbox? That's perhaps where we should advance the discussion. Some things are absolutely legitimate to remain within national remit, and perhaps even certain topics should go back to national level. But some others, especially on economic policy, make no sense. But it makes no sense to have a single currency and no fiscal policy. It's very basic, huh?
And this is very hard to change because either it comes from the member states, as you said before, because a bottom-up change in a system like this, very hard, because you have to lobby 27 member states who then have to vote for it in the council.
The solution will not come from our bubble. It has to come from a deeper society engagement, and it's where I'm missing. It's only the think tanks now which are talking about that. Like 20 years ago was much more dynamic, so the entire society was conceptualizing that, and I quite miss what Jean Monnet did at the end of his life, like this committee for the United States of Europe. What he did, he brought together the civil society, political parties, members of parliament, trade unions, think tanks, intellectuals, to push together, and because all these persons are influencers, and all this makes a snowball effect. They all were ambassadors of going the extra mile in European integration. And they were not people from the bubble. And this is powerful, and we are not having that. So civil society has a role, and starting with political parties. Because their job at political parties is not just to select who will be elected, it's also to renew the ideas in society and to frame them.
Yeah, and I also think that like citizens, they need to be more aware of how much a more unified Europe indeed would impact them in positive, concretely, like outside political parties. You said the fiscal aspect. It's true that, for example, if you look for investment and you are a small company and you can look for investment, not just in your member state, but in other 26, of course, it's easier for you to get funds, like these simple things.
But there is this new EU Inc. proposal, a very interesting case of what I think it's a smart thing that the Commission did, because so it's about corporate law, basically how you create a company, how you operate on your daily basis, and this is very fragmented. So in an ideal world, you would say we should harmonize that. We should have a single rule book, no national rules. But if you try that, you will fail. There is no member states will kill that. So what did they do? They say, okay, we create a 28th regime. But they called it EU Inc., which is, I think, a disaster in terms of communication, because nobody uses ink in Europe. It's American concept. Yeah. So I hope they just don't kill the concept with that crazy name. But they say, look, we create something, and then it has to make its proof. So, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as we say. If companies will use that, then it will start. But then how will companies get aware of that? Then you need the business communities to understand that and to be ambassadors, and trade associations and trade unions and etc. And these are probably also very important influencers, these business communities, because Europe started with them. And I'm very scared of seeing also more and more people from industry being, let's say, disappointed, to say the least, about the EU. And while they were before the first supporters of single markets, now we say, where is this machine going, if anywhere? There is this impression that we are going very far into green laws, which creates some disadvantages compared to competitors. And I would be quite scared that we lose the business communities, because they are the first influencers on making change possible.
And you try to communicate about all those things also with humor.
Yeah.
Do you think that people in Brussels and in the bubble have humor? How did they react to your book?
Well, I think you invited me, so I think you already have humor. I think coming back to my book, so this satirical story of a crazy law on the color of the sun, because where I make fun of some parts of the system. I was quite scared at the beginning that people would say, yeah, this guy is just making fun of the system to which he belongs. But no, in fact, people say you are describing the system accurately. Of course, it describes how it could go wrong at every step. But I made a difference between satire, which is a kind of a gentle criticism. Like you make fun, but it's not mean, and it's not sarcastic. I really make a difference between two. Sarcasm is mean, is to attack. I don't want to attack you. I'm a deep believer in the EU, but I think we also have in our bubble to be self-aware that we are a bubble. We have to pop the bubble at some point. It's what I try to tell to people who are paying me, you pay me as a lobbyist. I'm here to pop the bubble for you, to make it accessible to you, and also you to have access into the bubble. So, no, I think there is a sense of humor here. But then, can we convert that into action? I don't know.
Yeah, and talking about action, like we like to conclude thinking about the EU's future, how to improve it. If you could change one thing on how politicians and influencers communicate the added value of the European Union to the common citizens, what would it be?
There, I would mention something that could happen already at the next European election. And that's something I'm waiting at every election. Why not, before the election or just after, the parties, the political groups get together. They say, this time we need to write a coalition contract, a program, a common program. They say, look, EPP, Socialists, Liberals, whoever. Say, look, we have a majority of seats. This is our program. We commit to that for the legislature, and we impose that on the European Council and the Commission. And we say, European Council, you have to commit to that, and you will designate whoever you want for the Commission presidency, but that person will be elected only if they commit to that. So you are a bit breaking the equilibrium. Of course, you are undermining the Commission's monopoly of initiative. You are stepping on member states' shoes, but it's something MEPs can do. Political parties, mainly. I think the system needs to be shaken, to be disrupted, because it's when it's disrupted that it can change. And I think it's an experiment I would really like to see happening.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very cool ending, and let's see.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.